Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Derek Cullen, and this is a sensitivity analysis, a tool for capital budgeting. In today's agenda, we'll define the sensitivity analysis, look at the qualitative steps in conducting a sensitivity analysis, identify the quantitative steps in conducting a sensitivity analysis, define the capital budgeting analysis, and define the risk as it relates to a capital budgeting analysis. So a sensitivity analysis is a statistical method used to determine how changing the values of a specific independent variable affects the dependent variable under a given set of circumstances. This analysis helps us determine how much of an impact an input change has on a constant control, or in other words, how sensitive the target subject is to that change. Additionally, it's a method used to answer the question, if x were to increase or decrease, what happens to z? This method is widely used as a predictor of malleability. It's important to note that it's a universally applied method of analysis. It applies to science, finance, sales, stock, and just general questions in life. If you've ever wanted to see what change would affect something, you are indeed conducting this analysis. Based on these findings, you can make correlations between the data, establish some changing relationships, and ultimately make an educated and useful projection. Next, let's look at some qualitative considerations when conducting a sensitivity analysis. Identify the change factors that will affect the output. As the name implies with qualitative, we're looking for non-numerical values. Since this is business class, this would be things like company reputation. If the company has a great reputation and it's been around several years, a company like Nike, for example, you can deduce that one bad marketing advertisement won't cause the company to crumble. On the other hand, if a startup shoe competitor made the same unsuccessful marketing campaign, it could really make or break the business. Those are the type of items you need to consider, the bigger picture, non-numerical items that you can directly associate with a risk of investing in things like that startup company. You must also consider both internal and external factors. In this analysis, you need to consider both factors. Internally, it could be things like a planned management change that could have an associated risk rate if the CEO was planning to take the company in a completely new direction. Externally, you can consider factors like the chance of a new competitor emerging and entering your market to compete against you. Last, the focus should be on the higher change agents. In the qualitative steps, the focus needs to be on the things that you believe have the biggest cause and effect on the company. Since the goal of a sensitivity analysis is to analyze the company's resistance to change factors, you want to focus on the larger factors that actually cause change. This is the stage in the analysis where questions need to be asked that you can't put any number on. Next, we'll look at the quantitative considerations when conducting a sensitivity analysis. This is a much more direct approach. It's a numerical study of when x changes, what happens to z. Quantitative factors are numerical. When you look at the internal and external factors, this is where you're pulling in things like sales data, revenues, time considerations, startup cost, and other barriers to entry. This is the data that's ultimately going to be helpful in letting you project and forecast. Next, inputs can place a direct number on a rate of change or establish a risk rate based on each factor considered. You look at how each input relates to the output, and you can calculate it as a percentage of change. If you do multiple percentages of change, this leads you into our next bullet point. It allows for a more accurate future prediction. So you look at all these several variations of inputs and you identify trends, and by doing so you can see what decisions are more and less risky based on the changes of the factors before. Some changes may be linear and some may be parabolic. With a parabolic change, you can look at that assessment and actually determine a specific value you deem as an acceptable risk before reaching that inevitable spike you find in any parabola. Next, let's look at an example. Let's suppose you analyze something like sales data for bottles of water, and you're selling them to the local gas station and you're worried about the outside air temperature. You're trying to see how that affects your change. If you look at 1 month of data, you'll see that 5 degrees of increased temperature results in 10 more bottles sold. So you can then assume that if the next month was going to be hotter, your sales would increase. That's great, right? But we've defined a risk factor for sales in relation to weather. But did we do it accurately? This example actually lacks some qualitative perspective in the quantitative analysis. Since we only looked at a month or two, we left out all of the winter months where sales would most likely decline unproportionally. This brings me to my next point. This data can actually allow for very accurate predictions if we do it properly. If we were to take historical data from several years, we can actually project what it'll be each month with minimal deviations to risk, obviously assuming all other factors were held constant. For our final slide, let's link relating project risk to capital management. When a company plans to invest in new facilities, equipment, or products, it may engage in capital budgeting. Capital budgeting is a strategy that a company can utilize to plan future investment projects. Capital budgeting is merely where the company plans to invest or place its capital. As noted in the definition, it could be a new project. When you do a capital budgeting analysis, you need to look at all the different projects, assess the risk, and come up with a projected value of the success. By analyzing all the quantitative and qualitative measures, you're actually conducting a risk assessment. And those risk assessments are what you consider when you come up with where you want to budget your capital.